Abyssal Geographies, an ethnographic reply. In the spirit with which this collegial call and response invites my participation, I offer this reply to Chandler and Pugh's powerful provocation. I order my remarks as follows. First, some issues I have. I share these concerns to open lines of thought rather than encourage analytical closure. Second, I attempt to briefly take up the author's analytic offering and turn it towards a set of ethnographic concerns located in Dominica, in the Eastern Caribbean. I'm ill-qualified to offer significant comment on the contribution of this paper to an arena referred to as contemporary critique, high thought emerging from the American Academy. My reading of Morton, Spillers, and De Silva are limited, even if I know Benitez Rojo's and Christina Sharp's work rather better. I would not be so boastful as to even suggest that I understood all of what the paper was getting at. Yet, I will work with what I have grasped and go from there. What I might offer is a vantage, grounded in ethnographic practice, reading and place, situated along this archipelago, and consider how the claims made might take purchase in the Antilles. Since my ethnographic praxis is oriented towards groundwork, dialogues, and analytic modes that emerge from ordinary human interaction, i.e. the stuff of daily life, I situate and make sense of this meta-analytic, what the authors call abyssal geographies, in relation to the everyday Caribbean worlds with which I am familiar. I have been reading the works of Brathwaite of nearby Barbados and Glisson of neighbouring Martinique almost daily for the past few years, attempting to see how their concepts take hold in Dominica, to understand relations between human, land, sea and hurricanes in this island. Whitey Kubali, tall is her body, is how Dominica's indigenous peoples knew their island, the last in the Antilles to be colonized, a maroon and indigenous stronghold for centuries. I am a grandchild of this place, a place I've been visiting for a short lifetime, a place I've been returning to ethnographically for a decade. Thinking about this exercise of grounding theory here, I've been sitting, for instance, with Glisson's notion of, quote, relational complicity with the new earth and sea and cosmos, close quote, for those deposited in Caribbean plantations, asking how Dominicans made homes and fashioned lives in close relation to the elements and their everyday landscape. I have sat with Brathwaite's notion of the foundational catastrophe of the Middle Passage, from which Caribbean creativity emerges, an archetype for each catastrophe that would follow. I'm interested in what survival might mean in Dominica, and these authors lend cosmological clues that I read in dialogue with Dominican patterns of world-making in the hurricane's path/wake. It is with a similar approach that I've tried to work out what the Abyssal Geographies frame might contribute, A, to our understandings of Caribbean worlds, or B, these authors, i.e. Glisson, Brathwaite, Benitez Rojo, otherwise referred to as abyssal thinkers, what Abyssal Geographies might contribute to their bodies of thought. The reflections that follow, far from making general region-crossing claims, emerge from a small island, part of a wide and varied archipelago called the Antilles, itself intimately connected to a vast planet beyond its waters. Whose thought is being centered? To announce a Caribbean turn in critical thought, whether simply naming it or promoting it, is liable to draw skeptical looks from those toiling in and along this archipelago. Indeed, those who research the quite particular histories of Caribbean places are all too aware of the ways these places have fallen in and out of North Atlantic fashion, their repeating quote-unquote discovery and neglect by powerful external agents, an oscillating pattern that has persisted for half a millennium. How, might one ask, is this recent turn to the Caribbean radically different, for instance, from the creolization turn of the last millennium? Then, northern scholars took epistemic journeys to the Caribbean in search of theoretical instruments to make sense of globalization's emergent, quote-unquote, new forms. And of course, the Caribbean had been living with a kind of globalization for well over 400 or 500 years. They left with a sack of concepts uprooted from Caribbean histories, experiences, and cosmologies. And so today, 20 years on, An anxiety to think the world anew amidst the existential dread of our current conjuncture, referred to as the Anthropocene, leads Chandler and Pugh to, I would argue uncritically, announce another Caribbean turn. Perhaps this was to be expected. The archipelago has long been conceived as a fertile destination for extra-local imaginaries, desires, and projects, a kind of dream space for those seeking to figure worlds otherwise, or perhaps shatter them in this case. Indeed, islands seem useful microcosms in which to remake the world. For the onlooker, quote, the real Caribbean is always a performance of the vivid Caribbean of the imagination, close quote, as Mimi Scheller so powerfully reminds us. By locating abyssal thought in the work of Morton and Sharp, we get a North Atlantic Black Studies reading of Antillean worlds. These conversations across the Afro-Americas are important, and yet they offer a second-order reading, for instance, of Glisson's reading of his Caribbean milieu, and where the work of Cuban literary scholar Antonio Benitez Rojo brings us somewhat closer to home, his own open-ended theorization of Caribbean carnivals, improvisation, and cultural creativity come to be somewhat mechanically reordered to fit the abyssal frame. So what then of life beyond the abyss? To quote the authors, abyssal sociality is non-productive and non-creative in terms of adding new and proliferating entities to the world, so the lecture argues. How then to account for the creative processes of Caribbean world-making that I've suggested? The Black Metamorphosis, as Sylvia Wynter would call it, birthed transplanted Africans into a new world. It demanded emergent rituals, ways to praise deities, ways of making kin. Art must come from catastrophe, Brathwaite so powerfully reminds us. And so Caribbean study solely preoccupied by black being in the hold, always held by, tethered to enslavement, may miss the ordinary creativity and, quote, beautiful experiments that emerge from such histories. Or to turn again to Christina Sharp and pose it as a searching question, do you apprehend them and the beautiful lives that they make? Indeed, the profound historical memory of slavery, its durational presence, can be felt across Caribbean worlds. The plantation's memory and material consequences persist. In fact, enslavement remains unmourned the Atlantic world over. And more specifically, the abyss, kidnappings, forced crossings, the slave trade winds, the hold, the dispossessions, is integral to the work of Glisson, Benitez Rojo, and Brathwaite. But it does not consume or enclose their work. Brathwaite, for instance, insists on his right to envision the transatlantic wake as a cosmological pathway that carries forth ancient traditions, whether Kumina of Jamaica, provision grounds across the Caribbean, or Voodoo, the religion of many of Haiti's people, which Caribbean peoples have reshaped and continue to uphold. And for Glisson, the abyss forms a most painful gestation/birth that affords new ways of being related to one another, new ways of telling stories, sustaining the collective soul, and entering relational complicity with land, sea, and sky. Thinkers from the Antilles, then, inhabit a black majority space that bears the enduring scars of the abyss, the memory and recursive violence of modernity's beginnings and white supremacist reproductions. And yet their thought overspills this history, offering inordinate paths forward beyond a suspension of non-being always in the abyss. Our scholarly service. As a thinker guided by an ethnographic sensibility, a practice founded on relationship-based dialogues between humans who inhabit interconnected worlds, I fear that the desire for a theory that shatters the racial capitalist world is being asserted at the expense of engaging with real Caribbean people. Where, beyond Carnival, do we find real-world contemporary examples of abyssal practice? Or to put it otherwise, how are Caribbean peoples making life, or working to make life, on their own terms in the afterlife of conquest, kidnap, the plantation, and enduring experiences of racial capitalist ecology? Does abyssal sociality offer a useful frame for understanding these people's experiences and their sense of themselves as human beings. But prior to such considerations, perhaps there is a more central, motivating question to which we must first attend. Who is our work intending to serve? As an archipelago and repopulated, deforested, polluted, enclosed and exploited by imperial and enduring colonial design, from genocide to servitude to service, we might ask if the Caribbean should be expected to gift or give the gift of critique that shatters the modern world at all. Should the Caribbean be thought of as an enabling geography for unpicking such ontological puzzles? Or might we think instead of what an ethnography of relation might look like? We might aspire for a scholarly practice that gradually builds relationships to people and place, a praxis defined by care and radical solidarity, a sitting with difference and being in service of our interlocutors. All these elements can emerge as a response to the abyssal and may sit beside other intellectual preoccupations, but they do require us to move beyond critique as an end within itself. What, we might ask ourselves, does our work offer Caribbean people as they seek to live viable futures and thrive? Taking hold of an unknown that does not terrify. An earlier version of the paper, circulated prior to the plenary at which it was presented, featured a beautiful quote from Edouard Glisson's Poetics of Relation. It read, "We know ourselves as part and as crowd in an unknown that does not terrify." Caribbean futures are always imagined through exigency. When Dominicans say goodbye, they rarely call to a future date without the providential caveat, "See you tomorrow, God willing." In our warming world, this orientation towards the future becomes ever more vivid. The Caribbean plantation, which began with kidnapping and enslavement, was a test site for the world capitalist ecology we know today. The plantation's modern design, time sensitivity, complex assemblages, its subsidy of European industrial takeoff, were a beginning for the Anthropocene. And today, some of the worst effects of this Anthropocene return through planetary warming to the Antilles, repeating like the pattern of the cyclone, bringing intensified hurricanes that ride the very trade winds of the slave ship over rising seas that swell and surge during tropical storm and hurricane events. There is a historic and meteorological relation between the abyss and the hurricane. Hurricane Maria, the island's worst storm in living memory, caused widespread death and devastation to Dominica in 2017. 5 years on, people live with its effects, many still exposed to riverine flooding, some with memories of lost loved ones, and perhaps there's something of an abyssal memory that makes Dominicans fear storms, yet renders them in some way ready to respond individually and collectively to the storm's effects, an unknown that is feared but does not terrify. For their ancestors knew worlds that had ended, and then made themselves anew in relation to land, sea, sky, and one another. Perhaps recording and sharing stories of those who make life in the wake of catastrophe might inspire Caribbean kin, both as part and as crowd, to continually face the future as an unknown that does not terrify, as they engage in beautiful experiments that carry them far beyond the abyss.
So how did you and the people of your community heal or recover from the experiences of Maria?
Well, people recovered as far as I can say, people recovered. And what I think about black people and resilience, and not just black people now, I think is minority, people that are not very wealthy. Well, there was an old saying that necessity is the father of invention. And when people don't have all what they would like to have, they find ways to get things done. And so the people, they went through a lot, especially those who lost their property, their life. People lost their lives. People lost their loved ones and people lost their property. But I know it affected some of the older ones differently. The younger generation, well, you know, once you had a simple life and you had contentment in your life, you know, I guess we all realize that we have to get up and do what we have to do. Black people, we had our history of slavery. I guess that built resilience in the black nation, because, you know, our ancestors went through so much and yet still they stood up, and we are here, we are their descendants, and we are up to today. So that is resilience already. So I guess it's in our blood. And so people have bounced back. I mean, we're accustomed to a hard life. You know, we're accustomed. But one advantage we have is that God has blessed the land. God bless the land all over the place, but especially Dominica. Because anything, they said, once a seed is spat out, it grows in Dominica. So even if Maria took, you know, most of what we had, but, you know, see, there's a coconut tree in the bush up there. There is a mango tree survived by the river over there. A breadfruit tree survived down there by the church. So, you know, these little things, people go around and they make themselves, and as long as we have contentment, we have hope. We have hope, we have life, we have hope. That's how I see it.